Plugging our cars into the mains electricity supply when we get home at night might currently seem about as natural as shoveling coal into them before setting off in the morning, but all the signs are that's going to change. Hybrid cars were a first step in the direction of increased use of electricity to drive our vehicles, and fully electric models look like being the next. Only a car that will never go near a filling station forecourt except to use the jet wash or inflate its tyres might take some getting used to, but Nissan is confident that thanks to reduced pricing, an increased range and quicker charging time, its much improved Leaf can make the transition a painless one. It says much about Nissan's leadership in the field of full electric vehicles that at a time when most manufacturers are finalising prototypes with this technology, this forward-thinking Japanese brand has already fully revised its game-changing offering in this sector. This model, the Leaf. The name is an acronym for Leading Environmentally Friendly, Affordable Family Car, which is exactly what this was when first we saw it launched in 2011 as the first purpose-designed pure electric vehicle on the market. Back then, the only other offering in this segment was a hastily converted city car design sold under different badges by Mitsubishi, Peugeot and Citroën. In comparison, the prospect of spending similar money on a larger, more advanced Nissan Leaf seemed like a no-brainer decision for anyone seriously considering a car of this sort. The problem for Nissan, in the UK at least, was that hardly anyone was considering buying a fully electric family vehicle, and certainly not one costing close to £30,000. A Leaf might be better than anything else on offer, but it was still beset by the usual EV issues of low operating range and patchy public charging infrastructure. It was, in short, a car ahead of its time. Has that time now come? Perhaps. After all, today the cost of the technology has come down and the number of public charging points has dramatically increased. Plus, the whole idea of owning a pure electric car is now more widely accepted. It's a change in mindset Nissan has aimed to capitalise on by relaunching this Leaf model with a more affordable pricing structure, a smarter, more practical interior and a longer operating range. And the result could very well be the best car of its kind we've yet seen. Let's check it out. Let's start with the headlines. This car can travel nearly 20% further than it could before on a single charge, and if you spec it right, you can finish that charge in half the time. If that's enough to get your interest, then let's get behind the wheel and see what it's like to drive. Get yourself settled, and if you've tried a Leaf before, you'll find that things aren't very different with this improved model. If you haven't, then the whole experience will be as futuristic as it always was. Now, initially it feels just like the Focus-sized family hatchback it is, but release the now foot-operated parking brake and push the starter, and the electric experience begins. Virtual instrument graphics spring up in front of you, accompanied by a cheery chime, before a few seconds later you're ready to pull this mouse-shaped auto gear selector into drive. Electric cars are always, of course, automatic, and set off. But before you do, a quick check is needed of the all-important range indicator, designated by this bar graph and the mileage figure displayed beneath it. Now, it's a display you're going to get very used to staring at, since it'll determine exactly how and when you can use this car. Brands like Tesla have shown that a range of 250 miles or more is possible with very expensive electric vehicles. Affordable EVs, though, can't get anywhere close to that. But amongst these, this Nissan is probably now able to assume the mantle of best of the rest, thanks to an increase in claimed operating range from 110 to 129 miles. That's been achieved by this revised model thanks to a 30 kilogram weight reduction and the installation on mid and top range variants of a clever heat pump that uses 3 times less energy than would normally be required to heat the car. How? Well, by drawing that energy from the air outside, a technology approach that's well established in domestic use. In the real world, of course, you won't regularly achieve the kind of total range that Nissan is talking about unless you habitually drive like a nun. But the difference the most recent changes make is to allow a 3-figure operating range to be less of a pipe dream and more of an achievable reality, especially if you make good use of the helpful B mode that's been added to the gearbox. Select it rather than the usual drive setting by putting the lever back, and you'll increase the energy that can be harvested from regenerative braking and therefore extend the distance that you can travel. In this test, I've been more commonly getting around 80 miles out of a single charge, but that'll still be sufficient to satisfy the 80% of drivers whose daily mileage is less than that. Of course, range is less of an issue if charging is quick and easy. When one day the 50 kilowatt rapid chargers that can replenish a depleted battery to around 80% of its capacity in just 30 minutes are commonplace on our major routes, no one will think twice about taking an EV vehicle on a longer trip. Today though, such a journey takes a little more forward planning, though a couple of things do make that process easier. First, if you do get to the perspiration point when 7 to 8 miles from empty you find a voice prompting you to find a recharging point as a low charge turtle graphic appears on the dash, well then there's always the CarWings telematics system that most models offer to help you out. Now this always knows where the nearest public charging point is and can direct you straight to it. Helping to avoid that scenario is the availability of an optional 6.6 kilowatt onboard charging system, which can halve your charging time to as little as 4 hours, providing you can find a 7-pin socket to plug it into. As you might expect, over-exercising of your right foot depletes the batteries very quickly and means plugging in much more often. In fact, it's actually more tempting than you'd think to drive this car quicker than you intend to, or at least it is powering off from rest. Let me show you. Come to a Leaf with electrical expectations based around milk floats and golf carts, and the way that 100% of the torque is available right off the bat never fails to feel shocking. From rest to 30 miles an hour, this Nissan accelerates faster than a petrol V6, but progress slows as the revs rise, culminating in a 11.5 second 0 to 62 mile an hour time that's no better, but certainly no worse, than a conventionally powered rival diesel model. Now, power comes courtesy of a 360 volt electric motor, putting out the equivalent of 109 PS and a pokey 280 newton meters of torque as this unit revs rather promisingly to over 10,000 RPM. It'll only do 90 miles an hour flat out, but of course outright speed isn't the point of this car. No, its natural habitat is an urban one that'll see you trundling along in eerie silence. Actually, it's not quite silent. While designers of conventional cars bust a gut to get noise levels down, Nissan has had to actually add sound to this one to counter public fears that quiet electric vehicles might, as they approach, unpleasantly surprise unwary pedestrians and the visually impaired. Hence the speaker fitted in the engine bay that produces a low whine at under 15 miles an hour to warn the pavement bound of your impending arrival. Those Leaf owners of a nastier disposition can actually switch it off. In town, it'll make most sense to drive this car in its eco setting, which you activate via this steering wheel button. A setting which on the original version of this car combined a slower throttle response with extra regenerative braking to increase operating range by about 10%. Now the problem with that was that on the open road, where you don't want a slow throttle response, owners couldn't get the benefit of extra regenerative braking. Which is why on this car, the two systems now operate independently. Get beyond the city limits and you can disable the lethargic throttle response via the same steering wheel eco button, but at the same time snick the gear lever from D to B to still harvest the extra braking energy. And handling on faster twisty roads? Well, on the original version of this car, this ought to have been quite good, thanks to a centre of gravity the same as that in Nissan's 370Z sports car, and near perfect weight distribution. The trouble was with that car that the steering was so ridiculously light and devoid of feel that at the wheel you felt absolutely no inclination at all to drive it with any kind of verve. With this revised model, the engineers have improved things with revised damper settings that improve high-speed stability and ensure the car no longer floats rather weirdly when it encounters mid-corner bumps. There's a bit more weight in the steering too. It's still not what you'd call responsive, but you do at least get a little more feel for what the wheels are doing beneath you. Turning is actually quite sharp and there's plenty of grip, though also still plenty of body roll. Most importantly though, for potential buyers, the ride is very good. The Leaf was the first mass production electric vehicle to be designed from the ground up for purely battery power. Early EVs, like some of those still on the market, were merely conversions of cars originally created with petrol engines. Now, even if you didn't know this, you could perhaps guess the fact from a glance at this dramatic-looking Nissan. For example, since as an all-electric car there was no need to fit a bulky engine in the front, it has a stubby and sharply angled nose that produces a smart wedge profile and aids the strong aerodynamic performance. With this revised model, now British built in Sunderland, that nose now has to also accommodate the bulky charger and inverter, which used to take up space in the boot, but the designers have managed to do that without affecting the bonnet line. So, as before, the so-called smart fluidity looks remain a little unorthodox. Subtle grille changes are the only visual update over the original version. That and the addition of an LED light under the charger lid, which makes it a bit easier to connect up at night. Otherwise, nothing's really very different, and the futuristic styling remains unaltered, but then many will feel that to be wholly appropriate for such a groundbreaking car. The quirkiest detail is probably the raised profile of these blue LED headlamps, positioned to channel air away from the wing mirrors and reduce road noise. Things get a little more bulbous around a rear end dominated by this kicked-up roofline and these gently curved vertical tail lights, and of course notable for the total absence of an exhaust pipe. There is of course a battery instead, as before a 48 module lithium-ion power pack that isn't housed in the boot but under the vehicle's floor, helping create the low centre of gravity that helps so much with the handling. But perhaps the most important thing here is the overall size. At around 4.5 metres long, this was the first pure electric car big enough for proper family use, no more than around 200 kilograms heavier than a similarly shaped conventional model and offering cabin space and overall dimensions very comparable to that of a conventional Ford Focus style family hatchback. Even today, no other EV on the market can offer you more rear seat space. Thanks to redesigned front seats that free up another 53mm of legroom for rearward folk, the bench back here can comfortably accommodate 3 adults on short journeys, 2 on longer ones, and a trio of kids all day long. The important practical news with this revised Leaf, though, lies further back. I mentioned earlier that the charger unit and the inverter that the battery pack needs have been moved forward from the boot to the bonnet. Well, that's made a big difference to the cargo area. Luggage space is now 330 litres. That's a 40-litre increase, about the size of a piece of airline carry-on baggage, though top models lose 15 litres of that thanks to the need to house the subwoofer of the punchy Bose stereo. More importantly, when you push the 60/40 split folding rear bench forward, something you can't do in a rival Renault Fluence ZE, you now get a much flatter loading floor. True, the total cargo room on offer still isn't very big. The 1100 litre total potential seats folded luggage area that you'd expect when travelling 2 up in a conventional family hatch is reduced here to just 680 litres, but I can't see that unduly bothering too many potential buyers. The reason the boot isn't bigger is that the lithium-ion battery pack is mounted beneath the floor of the vehicle, a more pleasing consequence of which is the slightly raised driving position that you get behind the wheel. On this improved model, there's also the bonus that you can further adjust your seat for height, should you want to. Unfortunately, the more pressing change needed in this cabin, the adoption of a reach adjustable steering wheel, is still on Nissan's to-do list. Still, you can move the thing up and down, and with a bit of jiggling about, it's possible to achieve a pretty comfortable driving position in a cabin that seems very different from that of the original, until you realise that apart from the adoption of a foot-operated handbrake, the only major change is the adoption of a darker palette of plastics. The original light-coloured trim looked very modern, but proved pretty impractical for the cold, muddy climates of Northern Europe and Scandinavia. So, as before, there's an appropriately futuristically styled split-level dash with blue-tinted graphics that look pretty conventional until you peer closer and find that they're primarily geared towards advising you just how much further you can go before a charging top-up is needed. A mobile phone style percentage reading is now also included. The graphics advise you of your success in regenerating electricity, and there's an eco indicator to display the status of electricity consumption, with little Tamagotchi-like trees growing on the display depending upon how frugally you're driving. Further range information is provided by various functions that you'll find on the large telematics screen residing in the middle of the centre console, powered by a system Nissan calls Car Wings. Mid and top spec models get it, and a price to include a 5 years subscription to the system, here updated to be even more useful, as well as the usual stereo, sat-nav and Bluetooth phone functions that you get with a conventional infotainment setup. This one knows where every public charging point is and is always ready to direct you to one. You can also access Car Wings remotely via your PC or smartphone, planning a trip in advance or setting a timer to cool down the car before a journey so that you don't have to use valuable battery power doing so once on the move. The heating and windscreen demister aren't as off limits in this respect as they were in the old Leaf model though, thanks to a heating system that in mid and top range models is 70% less power hungry. There are now two ways of buying this car. As with the original version, you can purchase the whole product complete with battery, but at pricing now around £5,000 more affordable than the original 2011 model year figure. After subtraction of the government's generous £5,000 plug-in car grant for electric vehicles, that means a span in the £21,000 to £26,000 bracket. The other way of getting yourself a Leaf is to buy one without the battery at a £5,000 model for model saving. Then lease said battery from your Nissan dealer at a monthly cost that'll depend on your predicted annual mileage and ownership duration. Those two criteria will determine which approach will be more cost effective for you. There are 5 leasing deals based on annual mileages between 7.5 and 15,000 miles and for 12, 24 or 36 months. The cheapest way, which will see you paying around £70 a month, is to commit to the lowest mileage and the longest term. Other deals though could see that price increasing by up to 80%, so choose carefully. I'd summarise this by simply suggesting that if you're planning to keep your Leaf for a long period and use it quite a lot, then it's probably better to choose the battery inclusive package. If on the other hand it'll be a second or third car you'll use occasionally and chop in for a replacement after 3 years, you might save a couple of thousand over that period by opting for a lease agreement. The other point I'd make is trim related. I'd really advise against settling for the base spec Vizia model, as it does without a significant part of the technology that's really improved this car, like the pump-driven heating system that probably does more than anything else to extend this revised model's range. You don't get a quick charge port either, or an extra gearbox B mode that increases regenerative braking, able to charge the battery as you drive. You also do without the option to set up charging remotely. And you miss the Carwings telematics system with a sat-nav that always knows where the nearest public charging point is and can direct you to it. Ultimately, what it all boils down to is the realization that trying to save money on a base Leaf Vizia variant is a false economy, getting you a car that in truth isn't much of a step forward from the original Leaf model. In other words, finding another £2,500 to get yourself into the mid-spec Ascenta model that includes all of these things is therefore a wise move. Think of the cost of one of those as being somewhere between £22,000 and £24,000, depending on your method of purchase, and you've probably got a good idea of what you're going to need to shell out for a realistically equipped version of this car. To put that kind of outlay into perspective, you're talking of spending a couple of thousand more than you'd need to get yourself a decently specified version of a comparably sized mainstream diesel-engined Focus or Astra-sized family hatch, which is a premium that of course you'd very rapidly recoup in fuel and tax savings. The money Nissan asks is also about the same as you'd pay for a comparably sized petrol-electric hybrid like Toyota's Prius, and a lot less than a comparably sized diesel-electric hybrid like Peugeot's 3008 Hybrid 4. Plug-in versions of both these cars have been developed, but they're a lot more expensive. You probably wouldn't be considering this Leaf at all though if you still had half an eye on a conventionally engined car. So let's assume that you're fully bought into the whole idea of pure EV motoring. You've then to decide whether to fully commit to it with a battery-only powered vehicle like this one, or to choose an electric vehicle with a so-called range extender engine, a little petrol unit your EV will carry around to cut in and keep you going should you exhaust the battery range. The range extender option is potentially tempting, but it's also expensive. The three models you could choose, the Vauxhall Ampera, Chevrolet Volt design and BMW's smaller but trendier i3, all require a £30,000 budget. For that, you could get a Leaf and a second-hand conventionally engined runabout for longer trips. In most cases though, someone who can afford a car like this will already have another conventionally engined vehicle in their driveway. We're talking about someone then who's no real need to dilute the electric vehicle concept with range extender technology. Someone who wants to slash their motoring costs rather than merely trim them with a hybrid or a frugal diesel. And someone who's probably already looked at the few other pure electric vehicles out there and dismissed them in favour of this Nissan, which would be understandable. True, I can understand why conventional buyers put off by this Nissan's futuristic looks might consider Renault's Fluence ZE and Zoe models, but these are smaller, less practical cars that aren't much cheaper. The pure EV design sold by Mitsubishi, Citroën and Peugeot is tiny and expensive, and all-electric versions of Ford's Focus and Volkswagen's Golf are just expensive. If, having considered all of this, you decide that it is a Nissan Leaf that you really want, then you're going to want to know what's included in the standard spec, regardless of the purchasing route you decide to take. As I've said, the entry-level Vizia model lacks some key technology, as well as many of the niceties you'd want in a car of this price. There are front fog lights, air conditioning, hill start assist and a 4-speaker audio centre with Bluetooth, USB and iPod compatibility, but that's about it. One for taxi folk perhaps. Which is why most British customers will buy in at mid-range Ascenta level and get 16-inch alloy wheels, auto headlamps and wipers, power folding mirrors, a rear view parking camera, rear privacy glass and a 6-speaker sound system. as well as the key EV items I mentioned earlier, the more efficient aircon, the extra gearbox regenerative brake mode, the remote charging functionality, the quick charge port, and the CarWing sat-nav to guide you to the nearest public charge point. Here I've gone a bit further and opted for the top-line Techno version. For a couple of thousand over the cost of the Ascento model, you get a package of nice-to-have but not essential luxury items. Larger, smarter 17-inch alloy wheels, LED headlamps, heated leather seats, a 7-speaker Bose audio system, and a 360-degree around view monitor that uses 4 wide-angle cameras to allow you to view your car from the front, the side, or even from above. Safety kit runs to ESP stability control, the usual electronic braking and traction aids, 6 airbags, and Isofix child seat fastenings. As for options, well, there are only a handful of those, and all seem pretty important to me. Maybe not so much metallic paint, but certainly the rear roof spoiler that incorporates space-age solar cells to boost the 12-volt battery provided to power ancillaries. And a must-have is the 6.6 kilowatt onboard charger, which halves your charging times but only works with a 7-pin plug socket. You'll also need to allow a little extra for Nissan's 240-volt 16-amp charging box, installable by British Gas or Scottish Gas, which bolts into your home electricity supply to reduce overnight charging time. Assuming you can afford the upfront asking price, then cost of ownership is an area in which this Nissan shows up very well indeed. The phrase no-brainer springs to mind. Here's why. Let's start with most buyers' biggest potential saving, which will actually be nothing to do with fuel and everything to do with the fact that this car attracts absolutely no benefit-in-kind company car tax, potentially saving owners thousands every year. Let's say, for example, that I switched to this car after running a comparably sized diesel rival, say Vauxhall Astra 2-litre CDTI Auto, for example. Were I to do this, I'd find just over £300 extra in my pay packet every month. It'd be like being given a £3,600 annual rise. Well, actually, it'd be better than that, since I wouldn't have to pay for a tax disc, my maintenance costs would be about 15% lower, fewer moving parts, you see. I'd be exempt from the London congestion charge, and in some cities I wouldn't even have to pay for parking. And we haven't even got to fuel savings yet, which the AA reckon would, on their own, enable you to recoup the difference between this car and a conventional diesel competitor in under 3 years. Specifically, Nissan reckons that the savings you could expect would add up to around £800 a year over a typical annual 9,300 mileage in comparison to a diesel rival. You want me to break that down? Well, on a pence per mile basis, reckon on it costing you about 3 pence per mile to run a Leaf in comparison to about 11 pence per mile in a modern turbo diesel rival. And before you ask, yes, that does take into account the increased electricity charges that you'd incur with this Nissan. Specifically, expect this car to cost you about £2 in electricity every time you charge it up from empty to take your range from 0 to a maximum potential 129 miles. That figure assumes you've opted for the Ascento or Techno models, offering the development improvements that have created that much improved range. It used to be 110 miles in the original version of this car. Remember though that you'll struggle to achieve a 3-figure total operating mileage unless you habitually drive in eco mode and make full use of the regenerative braking. Nissan reckons the daily charging process will add about £25 on your monthly electricity bill, which most will happily pay to offset the average monthly £145 outlay they'd otherwise have spent fueling an equivalent petrol or diesel motor. Charging, of course, is a whole issue in itself and is a process that Nissan has done its best to simplify, despite the industry's failure to agree upon a common plug type or recharge lead length. Recharging will take around 12 hours when your car is connected to a normal household socket, or around 8 hours if said socket is boosted by Nissan's optional 240-volt 16-amp charging box. You can quicken that time even further if you swap the normal 10 amp cable and 3-pin plug that comes as standard for the 32 amp cable and 7-pin plug of an optional 6.6 kilowatt onboard charging system, which can halve charging time. Great if you've had a 7-pin socket installed at home, but in my experience it's a lot harder to find one of those at public charging points when you're out on the road. Even rarer to find on the go are the so-called quick chargers that have apparently been installed along so-called corridors of power on major routes in Asia, Europe and North America. These deliver 50 kilowatts of high voltage direct current and can replenish a depleted battery to around 80% of its capacity in just 30 minutes. If and when those are added in at garages and motorway service stations across our land, there'll be a rush for electric vehicles like this one. Own this car and you'll soon learn to sort out your own personal charging regime, with plugging in at night or topping up the battery at a public point when you go shopping becoming second nature. Should the very worst happen though, and you forget to connect up, head off in a rush and find yourself stranded, out of range on the highway halfway to where you're going, Nissan will provide a free recovery service for the first year to sort you out. A Leaf stranded by the roadside isn't, after all, very good advertising for them. But it's unlikely to ever come to that. To ensure that it doesn't, your dealer will give you what the brand calls its Care EV Leaf Customer Commitment Promise, a scheme offering 5 peace of mind pledges. First, a proper 24-hour test drive to enable you to properly get to know your car before you sign on the dotted line for it. Second, the opportunity to rapid charge for free at any Nissan dealership with a rapid charging unit. A fast-growing number have. Just check for your nearest location. Third, the option, free of charge, to borrow a conventional petrol or diesel-powered Nissan model for up to 2 weeks, so that you're covered for any special occasion that may require a really long trip. You just pay for the fuel and insurance. Fourth, there's the free pan-European roadside assistance I just mentioned, should you ever get stranded by the roadside. And fifth, there's a free battery state of health guarantee covering capacity battery loss. That's below 9 bars out of 12 within the first 5 years or 60,000 miles. And what about the green issues? Well, you can tell your green bearded friends that nearly 100% of the vehicle weight is recyclable and that the biofabric used to trim the seats is 100% derived from sugarcane. But this whole issue of eco-friendliness is of course a lot more complicated than that. Some in the green lobby get very angry about the whole pure electric car, zero emissions ethos. They reckon that ignores the well-to-wheel demands of supplying the electricity that powers cars of this kind. I'd respond by pointing out that these people usually completely overlook the fact that CO2 figures for conventional cars fail to take into account the logistical cost of getting fuel to the pump. Still, if you're one of those enviro-conscious folk, I'll tell you that Nissan has calculated that the burden of filling your batteries in this car will result in a theoretical, and highly theoretical, 54 grams per kilometre of CO2 being released into the atmosphere based on typical use of the UK's energy grid. Which means that a Leaf driver will still be having nearly half the environmental impact of a small petrol-electric family hatch like Toyota's Prius. And this car will reassure you of that fact as well. If you go into the CarWings telematics energy economy or eco-tree sections in the infotainment section, it'll tell you just how many so-called eco-trees you've saved on your previous journey, how your driving stacks up against others worldwide, and even how many grams of carbon dioxide have been saved by pure electric vehicles up to any given date. And the other issues you'll need to be aware of in running a Leaf? Well, insurance ranges between groups 23 and 25, so you'll be paying a bit more to your broker than you would be for a conventional diesel-powered family hatch. What about battery longevity? Well, After around 5 years of use, it is true that you can expect your batteries to be down to 80% of their original charge potential. But by that time, most owners will have traded in their car for another. This may affect resale values though. Also, bear in mind that after 5 years, you'll have to pay for a subscription to the very clever CarWings telematics system that drives much of the neat driver information software. As for your warranty, well, it's the usual Nissan 3-year 60,000 mile package for standard components, but there's a revised supplementary 5-year 60,000 mile coverage plan for the batteries that includes the so-called state of health clause covering you against excessive charging capacity loss. That's the one I mentioned earlier. Nissan is a brand that knows what it's talking about when it comes to electric power, with an EV history that stretches all the way back to 1947. Only with the introduction of lithium-ion battery technology in the 1990s, though, did their EV development really take off, and a car like their original Leaf become possible. Early all-electric adopters liked it, but wished it were cheaper, better to drive, and could go further on a quicker charge. So Nissan has delivered this improved model, offering small but significant improvements in all these areas. The remaining issues all have to do with things that are less in this Japanese brand's control. A longer operating range is possible from current battery technology, but only at a price higher than typical Leaf buyers would be able to pay. Even without this, longer journeys ought to be quite feasible in a car of this sort, but they won't be until a more powerful and widespread public charging infrastructure is in place to make them possible. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't recommend this car for the right kind of buyer. Operating range certainly isn't the issue the motoring press have cracked it up to be. Do they seriously think that anyone able to afford to spend this kind of money on a car of this sort will hail from a single car household? Of course not. Likely buyers will be considering this as a second or maybe even a third vehicle for short run use. I'll wager though that once they get one in the driveway, they'll be using it for 80% of the time. This Leaf won't be for everyone, of course. Those without a garage will join single car families and long distance commuters in dismissing it out of hand. But then no car is for everyone. As the Japanese brand points out, you wouldn't buy a GTR supercar for family use or a Pathfinder SUV as a city runabout. Where Nissan has succeeded though is in finally offering us a relatively affordable, family-sized, pure electric car that's pretty free of compromise, a model you could pretty painlessly switch into from something conventional. Which leaves us with what? A defining moment in electric vehicle history? It certainly feels like it.